Imagine a marriage, not between two people, but between two proud kingdoms. This was the Iberian Union. It began in 1580, a time of great change and ambition. Portugal found itself in a terrible bind. Its young king, Sebastian, had vanished in a disastrous battle in Morocco. He left no children, no clear heir to the throne. This created a power vacuum, a crisis of succession that left the country vulnerable. Who would rule Portugal now? Several claimants stepped forward, but one had more power and military might than all the others combined. His name was Philip II, the King of Spain. He was one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, and he had a legitimate claim through his mother, who was a Portuguese princess. Philip II didn't just ask nicely for the throne. He marched his army into Portugal to enforce his claim. After a brief struggle, he was crowned King Philip I of Portugal. Here's the clever part, though. This wasn't a straightforward conquest where Portugal simply became another Spanish province. Oh no, Philip made a promise. He swore to preserve Portugal's independence within this new arrangement. Portugal would keep its own laws, its own language, its own government, and its own overseas empire. It was to be a dynastic union, meaning the two countries would share a king, but remain separate entities. Think of it as two houses side by side, but with the same person holding the keys to both front doors. On the surface, this deal seemed quite reasonable. The Portuguese nobility, seeing the alternatives, largely accepted it. They believed their traditions and autonomy were safe. King Philip II, a shrewd and capable ruler, was careful to keep his word at first. He understood the delicate nature of this union. He appointed Portuguese nobles to important positions within their own country and respected their unique institutions. For a while, the system worked. The two great naval powers of the age were united under a single crown, creating a colossal global empire. From Madrid to Manila, from Lisbon to Brazil, the Habsburg king ruled over vast territories, a truly global superpower. But this careful balance was always going to be a tricky act to maintain. The idea of one king, two kingdoms, was a political tightrope walk. Spain was the larger, more powerful partner in this relationship. How long could Portugal truly maintain its separate identity when its king lived in Madrid and was primarily concerned with Spanish interests? The seeds of future conflict were sown right at the very beginning. While the initial promises were grand, the reality of being governed from a foreign capital would slowly but surely begin to chafe. The union that started with a promise of mutual respect would eventually be tested by the pressures of war, money, and pride. The promises made by Philip II were like wedding vows, full of hope and good intentions. But as time went on, his successors, Philip III and Philip IV, were not nearly as careful or as respectful of the agreement. They began to see Portugal less as a partner and more as a possession. The delicate arrangements started to fray at the edges. The kings in Madrid, distracted by grand European conflicts and the immense administrative burden of their empire, started to centralize power. They wanted to make their vast domains easier to govern, more uniform, and this meant slowly chipping away at the very autonomy that had been guaranteed to Portugal. A key promise had been that Portuguese administration would remain in Portuguese hands. This was one of the cornerstones of the Union. Yet, as the years passed, this promise was increasingly ignored. Spanish nobles and officials began to be appointed to important positions within Portugal's government. Most famously, the powerful Count Duke of Olivares, the chief minister to King Philip IV, pursued a policy of unification. He believed that for Spain to survive its many challenges, all its territories needed to contribute men and money equally. To him, Portugal's special privileges were an obstacle. Portuguese voices in the court of Madrid were sidelined, their influence fading away into the background. This wasn't just about jobs or titles. It was about control. The Portuguese aristocracy felt their power and prestige slipping through their fingers. They were being governed by outsiders who didn't understand their traditions or priorities. Decisions that affected Portugal's economy, its colonies, and its people were being made hundreds of miles away in Madrid, often by men who had never even set foot in Lisbon. This created a growing sense of alienation and frustration. The feeling grew that Portugal was being treated not as an equal kingdom, but as a subordinate territory, a mere resource for the Spanish crown's grand ambitions. Imagine being promised that you could still run your own household, only to find your neighbor's relatives moving in and telling you how to arrange the furniture and what to cook for dinner. That's how many Portuguese nobles felt. The union, which was supposed to be a partnership of crowns, began to feel more and more like a Spanish takeover in slow motion. The trust that had been established at the beginning was eroding with every new Spanish appointee and every decision that ignored Portuguese interests. The cracks in the foundation of the Iberian Union were becoming impossible to ignore, and they were spreading fast. Before the Union, Portugal had tried its best to stay out of Europe's endless squabbles. Its focus was on the sea, on its lucrative trade routes to Africa, Asia, and Brazil. But by joining with Spain, Portugal was suddenly dragged into all of Spain's fights, and Spain had a lot of enemies. The Habsburg kings were constantly at war, battling the Dutch for their independence, fighting the English on the high seas, and getting involved in the devastating 30 Years' War in Germany. Spain's enemies now became Portugal's enemies by default, and this came at a tremendous cost. The magnificent Portuguese Empire, once the envy of the world, became a prime target. The Dutch, in particular, saw Portugal's overseas territories as low-hanging fruit. They were at war with Spain, so why not attack the weaker part of the Spanish king's empire? Dutch ships, well-armed and brilliantly commanded, launched systematic assaults on Portuguese trading posts and colonies. They captured parts of Brazil, took over valuable forts in Africa, and seized control of the incredibly profitable spice trade routes in Asia. For Portugal, this was a disaster. Its source of wealth and national pride was being dismantled piece by enemies it had never chosen. The Portuguese people watched in horror as their empire crumbled. The sugar plantations of Brazil, the gold from Africa, the spices from the East Indies, all were under threat. And what did they get from their king in Madrid? Not much. The Spanish crown was too busy fighting its own battles in Europe to send significant help. The resources of the combined empire were being poured into wars in Flanders and Germany, not into defending Portuguese colonies in the South Atlantic or the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese were expected to pay taxes and provide soldiers for Spain's wars, but they received little protection in return. This created a powerful sense of betrayal. The Union was supposed to make Portugal stronger, but it seemed to be doing the exact opposite. It had hitched Portugal's wagon to a declining Spanish star, and now it was being dragged down too. The economic pain was immense. Trade revenues plummeted, merchants in Lisbon went bankrupt, and the wealth that had funded Portugal's golden age was now flowing into the pockets of their Dutch rivals. The very foundation of Portugal's identity as a great maritime power was being destroyed, not by its own mistakes, but by the foreign policy of a king in a distant land. As the economic and military situation worsened, something powerful began to reawaken within Portugal, a deep sense of national identity. For centuries, the Portuguese had prided themselves on their history, their language, and their achievements as explorers and empire builders. They were a proud people with a distinct culture. Being ruled from Spain, a historical rival, had always been a slightly bitter pill to swallow. Now, with their empire under attack and their autonomy eroding, that bitterness turned into outright resentment. The feeling grew that the Spanish were not just poor allies, but oppressive masters. This resentment was fueled by very practical grievances. The Count Duke of Olivares, in his desperate attempt to fund Spain's endless wars, imposed heavy taxes on the Portuguese. The people were being asked to pay more and more to support conflicts that brought them no benefit, only harm. They saw their money being shipped off to Madrid to pay for Spanish soldiers while their own coastlines and colonies were left vulnerable. This led to widespread discontent, not just among the nobles, but among the common people as well. Tax revolts and popular uprisings began to break out across the country, clear signs that the population was reaching its breaking point. Furthermore, the kings themselves seemed increasingly distant and out of touch. Philip II had made an effort to understand and rule Portugal personally. His grandson Philip IV, however, never even bothered to visit the country after his youth. He ruled entirely from Madrid, surrounded by his Spanish court. This physical and political distance made the Portuguese feel neglected and forgotten. They had no real representation, no one to speak for their interests at the heart of power. The government in Madrid was seen as foreign, arrogant, and completely indifferent to the suffering of the Portuguese people. This combination of neglect, high taxes, and cultural pride created a toxic, rebellious atmosphere. A sense of us versus them became deeply ingrained. Writers and intellectuals began to secretly circulate pamphlets, reminding people of Portugal's glorious past and calling for a return to true independence. The myth of the lost King Sebastian was revived, with many people clinging to the hope that he would one day return to save his people from Spanish rule. This growing nationalism was a fire waiting for a spark. The Portuguese were no longer just unhappy subjects. They were becoming a nation ready to reclaim its destiny. The year 1640 was the breaking point. The Spanish monarchy was in deep crisis, fighting on multiple fronts and stretched to its absolute limit. The long war with the Dutch was still raging. The war with France was going badly, and to make matters worse, a massive revolt had erupted in Catalonia, one of Spain's most important regions. The Count Duke of Olivares made a fatal mistake. He demanded that Portuguese nobles lead an army to crush the Catalan rebels. For the Portuguese aristocracy, this was the final insult. They were being ordered to use Portuguese soldiers to suppress another Iberian people who were fighting for their own rights against the central government in Madrid. This demand was the spark that lit the fuse of revolution. A small group of Portuguese nobles, known as the 40 conspirators, saw their chance. With the Spanish army tied down in Catalonia and elsewhere, Madrid was weak and distracted. The conspirators decided that the time to act was now. On the cold morning of December 1st, 1640, they stormed the royal palace in Lisbon. Their target was Miguel de Vasconcelos, the hated Secretary of State and the representative of the Spanish crown in Portugal. They found him hiding in a cupboard, and the coup was swift and almost bloodless. They threw him from the palace window, a symbolic act of defiance against Spanish rule. With the Spanish administration overthrown, the conspirators needed a king. Their choice was the most powerful and respected nobleman in the land, John, the Duke of Braganza. He was a descendant of the old Portuguese royal line and had been hesitant to join the plot, fearing it would fail. But with the deed done, he accepted the crown. He was proclaimed King John IV of Portugal, and the crowds in Lisbon went wild with celebration. After 60 long years, Portugal once again had a king of its own. The Iberian Union was officially over. A new war for independence had just begun. Spain, weakened and overextended, was unable to mount an effective response immediately. This gave King John IV crucial time to consolidate his rule and gather international support. The ensuing Portuguese Restoration War would last for nearly 3 decades, but Portugal, fired by its renewed sense of nationhood, ultimately prevailed. The failure of the Iberian Union stands as a powerful historical lesson. It shows that uniting 2 nations under a single crown is not enough to create a single people. Without mutual respect, shared interests, and a preservation of identity, such unions are destined to crumble under the weight of pride and resentment. Portugal had chosen its own path once more.